The quietest knock I ever made ended up changing my entire life, because the man who opened the door was not simply accepting a pizza. He was about to ask me to help protect a little girl's heart, and I had absolutely no idea what I was agreeing to. He was asking me to help protect a little girl's heart, and I had absolutely no idea what I was agreeing to. At 23 years old, I spent most evenings weaving through downtown traffic with insulated pizza bags strapped into the passenger seat of my aging Honda Civic. Delivering food was not the future I had imagined for myself, but it paid the rent on my modest apartment and left enough money each month to slowly build the portfolio I hoped would someday help me leave restaurant deliveries behind. Fashion had fascinated me since high school. Whenever business was slow, I filled sketchbooks with jacket designs, color palettes, and fabric combinations, dreaming that one day someone might actually wear something I created instead of simply tossing me a tip before closing their front door. My apartment building sat inside one of Minneapolis's older neighborhoods, where renovated brownstones stood beside newer luxury condominiums. The residents usually kept to themselves. Most exchanged polite smiles in the hallway before disappearing behind expensive doors. The only neighbor anyone ever seemed to mention was the man living directly across from me. People described him with the same sentence every time. Quiet single dad. Keeps to himself. Never causes trouble. I had seen him a handful of times over the previous month. At 31, he had effortlessly styled blonde hair that somehow managed to appear both polished and relaxed. He carried himself with calm confidence, wearing simple sweaters, tailored jeans, and clean white sneakers that somehow looked more expensive than my monthly paycheck. Beside him was almost always a little girl with bright eyes and endless curiosity, skipping instead of walking while holding his hand with complete trust. They seemed happy enough, yet there was always something unusually careful about the way he watched her, as though he believed every ordinary day was something fragile that could disappear without warning. One rainy Thursday evening, my delivery app assigned me an address that immediately made me laugh. Apartment 4B. My own building. I carried the warm pizza upstairs, knocked once, and watched the familiar blonde man open the door. Up close, he looked tired in a way expensive clothes could never hide. Not exhausted from work alone, but from carrying responsibilities that rarely gave him permission to rest. Before he could speak, the little girl peeked around his side and suddenly gasped. "It's the pizza hero!" she shouted, throwing both hands into the air like she just spotted a celebrity. My face instantly turned red. "Pizza hero?" I repeated with an embarrassed smile. She nodded enthusiastically. "You remembered my extra napkins last time, and you smiled even though it was snowing." Her father looked genuinely apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "She's been calling you that ever since." I laughed as I handed him the order. "Honestly, I've been called worse." The little girl giggled so hard she nearly dropped the paper plate she was carrying. For just a second, the apartment felt unexpectedly warm. Children's drawings decorated one hallway wall, fresh flowers sat neatly on the kitchen counter, and the smell of garlic bread mixed with vanilla candles. It felt like a home built carefully around someone precious instead of expensive furniture or perfect decorations. As I turned to leave, the man hesitated. "I'm Peter," he said, "and this is Ella, although I suspect she remembers you far better than you remember us." "Cole," I replied. "Nice to officially meet you both." He nodded thoughtfully, almost like he was debating something with himself. Then he quietly cleared his throat. "Actually, would you mind helping me with something?" I glanced toward the pizza boxes, assuming he wanted an extra pair of hands carrying groceries or moving furniture. "Sure," I answered without thinking. Peter looked toward Ella before meeting my eyes again. His expression carried a mixture of hope and nervousness that immediately told me this wasn't about lifting anything heavy. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "She remembers you as, though that one delivery made the two of you real friends," he said carefully. "Would you be willing to let her believe that friendship matters to you too, at least long enough to come to her birthday?" For a moment, I simply stared at Peter, convinced I had misunderstood him. Pretend that Ella already knew me? It sounded like the beginning of an uncomfortable misunderstanding, Yet nothing about his expression suggested manipulation or dishonesty. He looked like a father carefully choosing every word because one careless sentence might disappoint the person he loved most. I glanced at Ella, who was watching both of us with complete confidence, as though she already knew what my answer would be. Peter quietly invited me inside for a few minutes, explaining that he wanted to tell me the whole story before I decided. I stepped into the apartment, setting my insulated delivery bag near the entrance, while Ella happily disappeared into the living room. Peter poured 2 glasses of iced tea before speaking again. "About 4 months ago," he began, "you delivered dinner during one of the biggest snowstorms we had all winter. I was stuck on a conference call that could not be postponed, and Ella answered the door with me standing a few feet behind her. You probably do not remember because it lasted less than a minute." I searched my memory and slowly nodded. During busy evenings, I delivered dozens of orders. Faces often blended together, but I vaguely remembered a cheerful little girl asking whether driving in the snow was scary. Peter smiled faintly. "You told her that keeping promises matters more than bad weather. Then you handed her extra napkins because you noticed she was carrying her own plate." I laughed softly. "That sounds like something I would say." "It became something she never forgot," Peter replied. "After that night, whenever something disappointed her, she would say, 'The pizza hero always keeps his promises.'" His words settled over the room more heavily than I expected. I had no idea an ordinary delivery had become part of someone else's world. Ella suddenly returned carrying a notebook filled with colorful crayon drawings. Without asking permission, she climbed onto the couch beside me and eagerly flipped through the pages. One picture showed a smiling delivery driver standing beside a little girl wearing a birthday hat. Above both stick figures she had carefully written, "My friend Cole." I looked at Peter in surprise. He gave me an apologetic smile before quietly continuing. "Her birthday is next Saturday. She has been telling everyone that her friend Cole is coming. I tried explaining that you were only being kind, but children sometimes decide what is true with their hearts before adults can explain reality." I looked back at the drawing, noticing that Ella had even colored my pizza bag bright red. The simple picture somehow carried more trust than I felt I deserved. I asked the question that had been lingering in my mind. "What about your family? Grandparents? Friends? Someone she already knows?" Peter hesitated just long enough for me to realize the answer would not be simple. "We moved here less than a year ago," he finally said. "Most of the people I once depended on are no longer part of our daily lives." He did not sound bitter, only tired. He never criticized anyone or offered dramatic explanations. He simply stated the truth and left it there. That quiet honesty made me trust him far more than any emotional speech could have. The apartment suddenly fell silent except for the gentle humming of the refrigerator. Then Ella looked up at me with a hopeful smile that seemed almost impossibly sincere. "You are still coming, right?" she asked. For several long seconds I could not answer. I knew accepting meant stepping into strangers' lives in a way most delivery drivers never would. I also knew saying no would probably confuse a little girl who had done nothing except believe the best about someone she barely knew. I slowly smiled. "If your dad is certain he is comfortable with it, then yes, I will come." Ella wrapped both arms around my shoulder in an excited hug before racing down the hallway to tell her stuffed animals the good news. Peter quietly exhaled, almost as though he had been carrying that conversation for weeks. "Thank you," he said softly. "You have no idea what this means to her." Smiled and reached for my delivery bag, reminding him that I still had 3 more orders waiting in my car. As I stepped into the hallway, Peter wished me a safe night, and the apartment door gently closed behind me. Halfway across the hall, I glanced back for no particular reason. Through the narrow opening before the door fully latched, I caught sight of a large framed family photograph hanging inside the entryway. My footsteps stopped. One section of the photograph had been carefully trimmed away, leaving an empty space where another person had clearly once stood. Over the next several days, I found myself looking forward to deliveries in my own neighborhood more than anywhere else on my route. It surprised me how quickly one unexpected conversation had changed the rhythm of my evenings. Every time I returned to my apartment after work, Ella seemed to spot me before I even reached my front door. Sometimes she waved excitedly from the living room window. Other times she stood on the shared front steps with a coloring book balanced on her knees while Peter watched from a respectful distance, never assuming my time belonged to them. It never felt forced. If I looked tired after a long shift, Peter simply smiled and wished me a good night. If I had a few extra minutes, Ella eagerly showed me her latest drawing or asked questions that only a curious 6-year-old could invent. One afternoon she asked whether pizza delivery drivers ever became astronauts. Another day she wanted to know if famous people still had to wait at red lights. Somehow every conversation left me smiling long after it ended. The birthday dinner arrived the following Saturday exactly as promised. It was nothing like the large parties I remembered from my own childhood. There were no rented decorations, no crowded backyard, and no entertainers. Instead, Peter had transformed their dining room into something simple but thoughtful. Handmade paper flowers decorated the table, Ella's favorite chocolate cake sat proudly in the center, and colorful balloons floated gently near the windows. Only 4 chairs surrounded the table. One for Ella, one for Peter, one for me. The last remained empty until a cheerful older woman from the apartment downstairs arrived carrying homemade macaroni and cheese. Peter introduced her as Mrs. Barton, the retired elementary school teacher who occasionally watched Ella after school when work became unusually busy. The evening felt surprisingly comfortable. Ella insisted that everyone wear paper birthday hats, including Peter, who accepted his bright purple hat with a patient smile that made Ella laugh harder than any expensive gift could have. Watching him interact with his daughter quietly erased the image many people in the building seemed to have of him. He was not cold. He was simply careful. Halfway through dinner, Ella proudly announced that birthdays should always include one impossible question. She looked directly at me. If you could make one dream come true, what would you pick? Mrs. Barton immediately answered that she would choose perfect health for everyone she loved. Ella wanted unlimited puppies. Peter thought quietly before saying he would choose more ordinary mornings exactly like this one. Then Ella turned back toward me. I admitted that I hoped one day people might wear clothes with my name on the label instead of only carrying pizza boxes with my name on the receipt. Peter did not laugh or offer polite encouragement. Instead, something thoughtful crossed his face, almost as though he had quietly recognized a dream that sounded familiar. The conversation moved on, but I noticed him studying me for just a moment before looking away. That expression stayed with me long after dessert was finished. As the evening came to an end, Ella hugged me tightly and whispered, "I told you that you always keep your promises." Her words carried far more weight than she could possibly understand. After helping Peter clear the table, I gathered my jacket and walked toward the front door. While waiting for him to return from the kitchen with a container of leftover cake he insisted I take home, I found myself standing beside the hallway wall where several framed family photographs hung in perfect alignment. In the brighter light, I realized the damaged picture I had glimpsed earlier had not been an accident. Every single family photograph displayed along that wall had been carefully altered in exactly the same place. Someone had not merely disappeared from their lives. Someone had been deliberately removed from every memory that remained. I tried convincing myself that the photographs were none of my business, yet the carefully trimmed spaces lingered in my thoughts over the next week. They were not torn in anger or damaged by time. Whoever had removed those missing faces had done it with remarkable precision, almost as though preserving every remaining memory while quietly erasing one person from each moment. Even so, Peter never mentioned the photographs, and I respected the unspoken boundary. Life gradually settled into a comfortable routine. My delivery routes changed every day, but somehow I always seemed to return home around the same time Ella finished her homework. If I happened to arrive while she was outside drawing with sidewalk chalk, she proudly showed me every colorful masterpiece before running inside to wash the chalk from her hands. Peter thanked me each time I spent a few minutes talking with her, but he never expected more than I freely offered. That quiet respect made our growing friendship feel surprisingly effortless. One cool Tuesday evening, I walked upstairs carrying 2 grocery bags after finishing an early shift. Before I reached my apartment, I noticed a white envelope tucked neatly beneath Peter's doormat. It immediately caught my attention because the envelope looked identical to several pieces of forwarded mail I had occasionally seen Peter collect. This one carried a recent Minneapolis postmark and had been slipped beneath the doormat by the building manager after arriving with the afternoon mail. I bent down, intending only to keep it from sliding farther into the hallway, when Peter opened his door from inside. His expression changed the instant he saw the handwriting. He did not appear frightened. He looked deeply disappointed, as though he had hoped something familiar would finally stop happening. Without saying a word, he accepted the envelope and quietly thanked me. I assumed he would open it immediately, but instead he walked to a small, wooden cabinet near the entrance. He opened the top drawer. Inside rested at least a dozen similar white envelopes, each carrying different postmarks and forwarding labels from places Peter and Ella had previously lived. He placed the new one on top without breaking the seal. I could not hide my surprise. Peter noticed my expression and offered a gentle, almost apologetic smile. "They all come from the same person," he explained calmly. "I have not opened any of them." His answer only created more questions. "Are they threatening you?" I asked carefully. Peter slowly shook his head. "No. If they were, I would have handled that a long time ago." "Then why not read them?" For several quiet seconds, he looked toward the hallway where Ella's laughter drifted faintly from her bedroom. "Because some doors stay closed for a reason," he finally replied. "Not every truth arrives at the right time, especially when a child is finally beginning to feel safe again." His words carried no bitterness, only quiet exhaustion. I realized he was not protecting himself nearly as much as he was protecting Ella. I respected that choice enough not to ask another question. Instead, we changed the subject, talking about ordinary things until Ella happily appeared carrying one of my old sketchbooks that I had accidentally left behind after her birthday. She had not drawn inside it. She had simply placed a bookmark between two pages she especially liked. "These jackets look real," she said with complete sincerity. Peter studied the sketches for a long moment before looking back at me. "You designed all of these?" I nodded, suddenly feeling embarrassed. "Mostly for practice." Peter looked up from the sketchbook with quiet hesitation. "Would you mind if I photographed 3 of these pages? I know someone whose opinion I trust, but I will not share anything unless you are comfortable with it." He carefully turned another page, examining the details with surprising attention. "You understand proportion better than you realize," he said. "You also know how fabric should move instead of simply how it should look." I laughed awkwardly. "That sounds far more impressive than delivering pizza." Peter smiled for the first time that evening. Dreams rarely begin where they eventually belong. A few days later, while I was finishing lunch before my afternoon shift, my phone rang from an unfamiliar Minneapolis number. Assuming it was another customer, I answered casually. Instead, a polished voice introduced herself as an editor from one of the country's most respected fashion magazines. After confirming my name twice, she asked a question that left me completely speechless. "Mr. Alston," she said warmly, "Peter Laurent recently recommended your portfolio to us. Would you be interested in submitting additional work for our Emerging Designers feature?" For several seconds, I wondered whether someone was playing a prank. I glanced at my phone screen to make sure I had answered the right call, but the woman patiently repeated her introduction before asking again whether I had been collaborating with Peter Laurent. I admitted that Peter was my neighbor and that I had no idea he had shared my work with anyone. There was a brief pause before she apologized for the confusion. She explained that Peter had quietly recommended an emerging designer whose work deserved attention, and my name had appeared with several sketches attached to the recommendation. Before ending the call, she encouraged me to send additional portfolio samples if I was interested in being considered for a feature highlighting promising new talent. She explained that Peter had only shared 3 finished sketches as an introduction, and that any further evaluation would depend entirely on the additional portfolio I chose to submit myself. After hanging up, I remained motionless in my car long enough for my next delivery notification to remind me I was still on the clock. The entire conversation felt impossible. Peter had never mentioned recommending anyone. He had simply flipped through my sketchbook one evening, asked whether he could photograph 3 finished pages to show a trusted industry contact, and returned it without making any promises. Yet somehow those few quiet minutes had reached one of the most respected fashion publications in the country. That evening I knocked on his apartment door. After finishing work, Peter answered with the same calm expression he always wore, except this time he seemed unsurprised to see me. I held up my phone with a confused smile. "Did you send my designs to someone?" He looked mildly embarrassed before stepping aside so I could come in. Ella sat at the dining table building an elaborate castle out of colorful blocks, happily humming to herself while pretending not to listen. Peter poured 2 cups of coffee before answering. "I only shared the 3 finished pages you allowed me to photograph with someone capable of judging them fairly," he said. "Everything else happened because your designs deserved another set of eyes." I stared at him in disbelief. "You could have at least warned me." He smiled softly. "If I had warned you, you probably would have spent the entire week worrying instead of continuing to draw." His answer somehow sounded perfectly logical. Curiosity finally overcame my hesitation. "Who exactly are you, Peter?" For the first time since we met, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. He walked toward a bookshelf, picked up an old magazine, and quietly handed it to me. The cover featured a younger version of him standing beneath bright runway lights, surrounded by photographers. The headline described him as one of the most influential fashion designers of his generation. I slowly turned several pages, finding photographs of international runway shows, interviews with luxury brands, and collections displayed in Paris, Milan, and New York. None of it matched the quiet man who spent evenings helping his daughter finish homework and reminding her to brush her teeth before bed. I looked back at him, almost laughing from pure disbelief. "You never told me any of this." Peter shrugged gently. "Because I wanted you to meet your neighbor, not a headline." Before I could respond, Ella proudly interrupted to show us a tiny paper dress she had folded from colored construction paper. Peter praised her creativity with complete sincerity before helping her tape one corner that had come loose. Watching him in that ordinary moment made the magazine feel strangely unimportant. Whatever recognition he had earned, it clearly was not the center of his life anymore. Later that week, my curiosity led me to search his name online. Hundreds of articles appeared describing his remarkable career, but one detail repeated again and again. Nearly every publication wondered why he had suddenly withdrawn from public life while still at the height of his success. Some speculated that he had become difficult to work with. Others claimed he simply lost interest in fashion. None of the stories sounded anything like the man I knew. Then I found one interview published several years earlier. In a single sentence, Peter explained that some opportunities were worth missing if they allowed him to be present for the moments his daughter would only experience once. Reading those words quietly changed the way I viewed success. The following afternoon, I returned home carrying groceries when I noticed someone I had never seen before standing outside Peter's building entrance. The man appeared to be in his late 30s, dressed neatly but shifting his weight with visible uncertainty. The instant Peter stepped outside holding Ella's backpack, both men locked eyes across the sidewalk. Peter stopped walking. The warmth disappeared from his face, replaced by a silence that seemed to carry years of unfinished history. Almost under his breath, he whispered words I was never supposed to hear. I truly hoped he would never learn exactly where we had finally settled. Peter remained perfectly still for several long seconds, his hand resting lightly on Ella's shoulder as though making certain she felt safe before anything else happened. The man standing across the sidewalk did not move any closer. He simply removed his hands from his coat pockets and waited patiently, his expression carrying none of the confidence I expected from someone who had unexpectedly appeared after years of silence. Ella looked back and forth between them with innocent curiosity. "Daddy?" she asked softly. "Do you know him?" Peter closed his eyes for the briefest moment before answering. "Yes." His voice was calm, but I could hear how much effort that single word required. He knelt beside Ella and smiled gently. "Would you mind going upstairs with Mrs. Barton for a little while? I think she is making those chocolate chip cookies you like." Ella looked disappointed to miss whatever was happening, yet she trusted her father completely. Just then Mrs. Barton stepped out of the lobby carrying a small grocery bag, and after Peter quietly asked whether she could keep Ella company for an hour, she warmly agreed without asking unnecessary questions. Once Ella disappeared inside the building, the silence between the two men somehow became even heavier. I remained several feet away, unsure whether I should leave or stay. Peter glanced toward me and gave the slightest nod, silently letting me know he did not mind my presence. The man finally spoke. "I am Raymond," he said, "your older brother." Later I would learn that Raymond had spent years mailing letters to every forwarding address Peter left behind. When the latest forwarding notice finally led him to Minneapolis, he chose to come in person instead of sending yet another envelope that might never be opened. Hearing those words instantly explained the unopened letters, the missing photographs, and the sadness that had quietly followed Peter from the day we met. Raymond looked nothing like the villain I had unconsciously imagined. He appeared exhausted, as though regret had aged him faster than time alone ever could. "I know you never wanted to see me again," Raymond continued carefully. "I understand if today changes nothing." Peter folded his arms but did not interrupt. Raymond reached into a leather folder and removed several photographs, keeping them in his own hands instead of trying to force them upon Peter. "I did not come here asking for forgiveness," he said. "I came because I could not let another year pass without telling you that I was wrong." Peter's expression remained unreadable. "Wrong about what?" Raymond lowered his eyes before answering. "After Ella's mother died, her maternal grandparents challenged your custody, arguing that your international career made you an unstable parent. During those hearings, I believed every rumor repeated about you instead of standing beside my own brother. I convinced myself that you had pushed everyone away, because success mattered more than family, even though the truth was that you had stepped away from your career to give Ella a stable home. I chose comfortable assumptions instead of asking you what had actually happened. Worse, when the court asked whether your career made you unreliable, I refused to defend you. My silence nearly helped other people take Ella away from you. By the time the court confirmed you had always been Ella's safest and most committed parent, you had moved away with her and cut contact with everyone who had failed you. His voice never became dramatic. If anything, the quiet honesty made every sentence feel more believable. Peter looked toward the sidewalk instead of at his brother. "So the letters were apologies?" Raymond slowly shook his head. "No, they were explanations. I knew apologies would mean nothing until you understood why I failed you." Peter stood silently, and for the first time since I met him, I realized silence could be louder than anger. After nearly a minute, Raymond carefully held out the folder. "Everything I should have said years ago is inside. Read it whenever you are ready, or never. That choice belongs to you." Peter accepted the folder without opening it. His shoulders remained tense, but something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. It was not forgiveness. It was simply the willingness to listen someday. Just as Raymond prepared to leave, the apartment building door opened again. Ella skipped outside carrying a large sheet of drawing paper with colorful markers still tucked beneath one arm. "Daddy," she called happily. "I finished my picture of everyone who makes this place feel safe." She ran directly toward Peter, completely unaware of the history standing only a few feet away. Smiling proudly, she lifted the drawing so everyone could see it. For figures stood hand in hand beneath a bright blue sky. Peter, Ella, me, and one final person with no face, no name, and no color except a carefully outlined empty shape. Ella pointed to the unfinished figure with complete certainty. "I left the spot open because sometimes people find their way back home." None of the adults spoke for several seconds. After Ella held up her drawing, she looked from one face to another with innocent anticipation, clearly expecting someone to admire her artwork rather than realizing she had quietly reached into years of silence. Raymond blinked several times before lowering his eyes, and I noticed him pressing his lips together as though trying to steady emotions he had not expected to face that afternoon. Peter accepted the drawing with gentle hands and studied every detail. Ella had carefully colored his sweater the same shade of blue he wore almost every weekend. She had drawn herself with an oversized smile and bright yellow rain boots. Somehow she had even remembered my red insulated pizza bag, although she had made it almost as tall as I was. Then there was the fourth figure. It stood beside all of us with an empty face and unfinished shirt, waiting patiently for someone to decide who belonged there. "Why did you leave this one blank?" Peter asked softly. Ella answered without hesitation. "Because sometimes safe people become family later." Those 4 simple words settled over the sidewalk with more weight than any long speech could have carried. Raymond quietly wiped one eye before smiling at Ella. "You must be an amazing artist." She smiled proudly. "Cole says pictures tell stories before people do." I looked at her in surprise because I had completely forgotten saying something similar weeks earlier while explaining one of my fashion sketches. Children really did remember everything that mattered to them. Raymond thanked Peter for accepting the folder, promising he would not appear again unless Peter chose to contact him first. Without another attempt to defend himself, he quietly walked away toward the parking lot. No dramatic goodbye, no emotional pleading. Just one final respectful glance before disappearing around the corner. Peter remained standing with the folder tucked beneath one arm and Ella's drawing in the other. Later that evening, after Ella had fallen asleep and the apartment had become peacefully quiet, Peter knocked on my door carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. We sat together on the small balcony outside my apartment, watching the city lights flicker beyond the neighboring rooftops. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Peter placed the folder on the table between us. "I think I am ready," he admitted. He slowly untied the thin ribbon holding the papers together and removed the first letter. Instead of rushing through it, he read every line carefully. Then he opened another, and another. The silence felt different now. It no longer carried avoidance, carried understanding. About halfway through the stack, a small envelope slipped onto the table. It contained several old photographs that had never been altered. I immediately recognized the missing faces from the frames inside Peter's apartment. In those original pictures, Raymond stood smiling beside Peter while holding a much younger Ella shortly after she was born. Other photographs showed birthdays, family picnics, and ordinary afternoons that had once belonged to happier years. Nothing about them suggested a family built on resentment. Peter gently touched one picture with his fingertips before quietly saying, "I thought these were all gone." Raymond had apparently spent years preserving every original photograph after realizing how much had been lost. Not to erase the past, but to protect it until Peter was ready to decide what to do with it. Peter smiled sadly as he looked through them one by one. "Maybe I spent so much time protecting Ella from painful memories that I accidentally protected her from good ones too." His voice carried regret, but not defeat. It sounded like someone finally willing to stop running from yesterday. After placing the photographs back into their envelope, Peter looked toward me with an expression I had never seen before. It was calm, grateful, and quietly vulnerable all at once. Then he asked a question so unexpected that I forgot to answer for several seconds. "Cole," he said gently, "would you consider helping me with something much more important than a birthday party?" Peter rested both hands around his mug before speaking again, carefully choosing each word instead of rushing into a conversation that clearly mattered to him. "The first favor I asked you for was never really about Ella's birthday," he admitted. Quietly, "that was simply the easiest way to explain why she wanted you there." I listened without interrupting. He looked toward the apartment across the hallway where Ella was sleeping peacefully before continuing. "Children notice changes long before adults admit they exist. After her mother passed away several years ago, Ella stopped laughing the way she used to. She smiled when people expected her to smile, but the joyful part of her slowly disappeared. Then one snowy evening a pizza delivery driver showed up exactly when he promised, treated her like she mattered, and unknowingly reminded her that dependable people still existed. I felt my throat tighten. I had always believed that delivery lasted less than 2 minutes and disappeared from people's memories before the pizza box even reached the kitchen table. Peter gently shook his head as though reading my thoughts. "She began looking out the window every evening hoping your car would come back. She talked about the pizza hero more than cartoons, birthday presents, or school. Your kindness became one small part of the progress she was already making through school, counseling, Mrs. Barton's support, and the stability we had worked hard to rebuild. His voice remained calm, but every sentence carried the gratitude of a father who had watched hope slowly return to his daughter. I smiled awkwardly. I never realized I was doing anything important. Peter answered with a quiet smile of his own. The people who make the greatest difference usually never do. Then he finally explained what he was asking. He was not asking me to replace anyone, make promises I could not keep, or become responsible for Ella's happiness. He only wanted to know whether I would be willing to remain a consistent part of her life, and of his, because disappearing without explanation would hurt her more than never attending the birthday at all. I told him I could not promise what the future would look like, but I could promise not to vanish without an honest conversation. His words settled into a comfortable silence that neither of us seemed eager to interrupt. Several days passed, and life continued with a new sense of ease. I still worked my delivery shifts, continued sending sketches to the magazine editor who had contacted me, and spent occasional evenings helping Ella with simple art projects while Peter finished work calls from home. Over the following weeks, I exchanged several emails with the magazine editor, refining my portfolio one collection at a time while balancing late-night delivery routes. The apartment no longer felt guarded. The old photographs Raymond had returned gradually appeared inside new frames throughout the hallway. Peter did not replace the altered pictures immediately. Instead, he let Ella choose where each restored photograph belonged, allowing her to discover family memories naturally rather than through painful explanations. Watching her excitement reminded me that healing often happened through ordinary moments instead of dramatic conversations. Then, one Friday afternoon, Peter knocked on my apartment door carrying an envelope unlike any I had seen before. He handed it to me with an expression I could not quite read. Inside was an official contract from an international fashion house headquartered in Milan. They wanted Peter to lead one final seasonal collection overseas for approximately 6 months. I looked up in surprise. This is incredible. Peter nodded slowly. Professionally, yes. He paused before adding the part that clearly troubled him. Personally, it changes everything. He explained that he had turned down similar offers for years while raising Ella, but this particular project had been designed around charitable scholarships for young designers entering the industry. Accepting it would allow him to mentor dozens of emerging artists while securing Ella's financial future at the same time. Yet taking the position meant temporarily moving overseas. He folded the contract and quietly slipped it back into the envelope. I have already decided to accept. I forced a smile and congratulated him because it was exactly what any supportive friend should have done. Even so, an uncomfortable emptiness settled inside me before I fully understood why. Over the following week, I caught myself noticing little things I had previously taken for granted. The hallway seemed quieter when Ella was at school. My evenings felt strangely incomplete if I did not hear her cheerful voice asking about my latest delivery or my newest sketches. Without realizing it, the apartment building had slowly become more than simply the place where I slept after work. It had become home because of the people living across the hall. One evening, as Peter carefully packed several design portfolios into a large travel case, Ella wandered into the living room carrying her favorite stuffed rabbit. She looked from the suitcase to her father, then toward me. After thinking for a long moment, she asked the simplest question imaginable, yet somehow it stopped both of us in our tracks. If neighbors become family, she asked softly, do they still have to live next door? Neither Peter nor I answered Ella immediately. Instead, Peter smiled gently and knelt beside her, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face. Families carry each other, he said softly. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they live across an ocean. What matters is that they never stop showing up for one another. Ella seemed satisfied with that answer and hugged both of us before happily returning to her room with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm. Her footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving an unexpected silence between Peter and me. A week later, I drove them to the airport before sunrise. The terminal was busy with travelers beginning ordinary mornings, yet our goodbye felt strangely quiet. Peter thanked me for everything I had done for Ella, but I realized I was the one who owed him gratitude. Before walking toward security, he handed me a slim envelope. "Do not open it until next month," he said with a small smile. "Promise?" I nodded. Ella hugged me tightly one last time before waving enthusiastically all the way down the concourse. Their flight disappeared from the departure board, and for the first time in months my apartment building truly felt empty. The weeks that followed were filled with long delivery shifts, portfolio revisions, and occasional video calls with Ella, who eagerly described every museum, bakery, and colorful street she discovered overseas. Peter looked happier than I had ever seen him, but I could still sense how much he missed home. Exactly 1 month after their departure, I finally opened the envelope. Inside was an invitation to the final runway presentation of Peter's 6-month collection, scheduled to take place in Minneapolis, along with a handwritten note. Some collections are designed from imagination. This one was designed from gratitude. I hope you will be there. I counted the days without admitting to myself how much I wanted that evening to arrive. When the runway show finally opened, the theater filled with designers, journalists, students, and longtime admirers of Peter's work. I found my assigned seat near the front, still wondering why he had insisted I attend in person. The lights dimmed, soft music filled the room, and the first models stepped onto the runway wearing elegant collections inspired by ordinary life rather than luxury alone. Warm earth tones reflected neighborhood sidewalks after rain. Tailored coats echoed simple conversations between strangers. Comfortable knitwear resembled the sweaters Peter always wore while helping Ella with homework. Every design felt familiar in a way I could not explain. Then the final presentation appeared on the large screen behind the runway. The collection carried a single title, Home Next Door. Images slowly faded across the screen. A child's crayon drawing, a red insulated pizza delivery bag, paper birthday hats, fresh flowers on a kitchen counter, sketchbooks resting beside pizza boxes. Moments so ordinary that most people would never think to preserve them. My throat tightened as I realized every piece had quietly been inspired by the life we had shared across a single hallway. After the applause settled, Peter walked onto the stage holding Ella's hand. Instead of giving a speech about fashion, awards, or international success, he looked directly toward my seat. "The most meaningful designs I have ever created," he said calmly, "were inspired by people who reminded me that home is built by kindness repeated often enough to become trust." Then he smiled in the same quiet way he had the day we first met. When the audience began leaving, I found Peter and Ella waiting backstage. Without hesitation, I walked toward them, and this time there was no uncertainty left between us. No carefully guarded distance. No need to pretend we were only neighbors brought together by coincidence. Peter laughed softly before saying something I had not expected. "The Milan project wrapped 3 weeks earlier than planned," he admitted. "Ella and I returned quietly a few days ago so I could prepare this final Minneapolis presentation. I wanted to tell you face to face that none of the attention, contracts, or headlines changed what that hallway had come to mean to Ella and me." I smiled before answering. "You stopped being a headline a long time ago." Peter held my gaze for a quiet moment before asking whether I would let our next chapter begin as something more honest than friendship between neighbors. I smiled and told him I had been waiting 6 months for him to ask. Our first real date happened the following evening, without cameras, runway lights, or anyone pretending the connection between us was accidental. Ella slipped one hand into mine and the other into Peter's as we walked out of the theater together into the cool Minneapolis evening. The apartment across the hallway was no longer simply the place where my neighbors lived. It had quietly become the place where my future had first knocked on the door. Perhaps stories like this quietly remind us that the moments shaping our lives rarely arrive with dramatic announcements. Sometimes they begin with ordinary conversations, unexpected kindness, or a promise made without realizing how deeply it will matter later. There are times when the people who change us most are not those with impressive titles or remarkable achievements, but those who consistently choose patience, honesty, and compassion during life's smallest moments. Maybe home is not always defined by an address or even by the years we spend somewhere. Perhaps it is created little by little through trust, shared memories, and the quiet decision to remain present for one another even when life changes direction. Those simple choices often leave the longest lasting impressions, long after bigger accomplishments have faded into memory. I would truly enjoy hearing your thoughts about the story and the choices these characters made. If you found yourself in Cole's place, or in Peter's, what decision do you think would have shaped your future? And what would you have wanted to say before that first quiet knock on the door?